Jaden grows up in immense wealth shaped by humble, ethical parents. A childhood incident exposes how envy distorts friendships. As an adult, she marries Jack, who initially seems genuine. After her father dies and leaves her the family estate, Jack's curiosity hardens into greed. He attempts to alter ownership through a fraudulent lawyer and loses hundreds of thousands. Jaden leaves him, protects the estate, and transforms it into a living space for community and healing with her mother. She finds closure and strength without needing revenge. Fog stitched itself through the cedars as the hill woke up. The pond breathed, its skin puckering with the slow mouths of koi. In the distance, the city blinked and remembered its name. Here, at the edge of all that noise, our house knew mine. I stepped onto the balcony barefoot, the wood cool and familiar. The railing wore grooves from a hand that sanded it 100 evenings for no reason except that good things deserve attention. My father said that. He also said a house can learn the character of the people who live inside it. I believed him when I smelled walnut and rain and heard my mother humming 2 rooms away. Downstairs, the jazz was a little too loud and slightly off the beat. She always started the record at the wrong track and left it there on purpose, the needles scratching in the quiet parts. Imperfections prove we're alive. She'd grin and sprinkle cinnamon on oatmeal like confetti on a quiet parade. We were wealthy, if you asked the property lines or the windows tall enough to frame a change of season. But mornings were simple. My father measured eggs in a teacup, not because he needed to, but because he liked to make rules out of rituals. He sketched beams beside grocery lists and folded napkins into clean angles. Everything felt deliberate. He built this place over 15 years, one line at a time, then sanded the lines until they felt like a gentle instruction. The garden climbed, stone upon stone, until it learned how to hold itself. The maple trees rehearsed autumns, every year a fuller performance. My mother taught classes at the community college and came home with highlighters in her hair. She could turn an index fund into a campfire story and make a sandwich taste like a budget decision. Once, when I was 8, I asked for a game console. She pointed to a jar, added a label, Jaden's yes. For months later, I'd ironed pillowcases, matched socks, and learned that saving is a kind of patience. When I walked into the living room cradling that box, my mother smiled like I'd brought home a diploma. You didn't buy a console, she said, you bought a story about yourself. People think childhood is a paradise. Mine was a workshop. We built things, habits, jokes, the ability to stand still in storms. But no one tells you the first storm isn't thunder. It's a rumor. The year I turned 12, a plastic screen cracked in my palm, and the sound it made was the sound of a friendship splitting. At Rockridge Middle, silence is a crowd sport. Eyes found me like hands do the soft part of fruit. Someone said rich, and it wasn't a compliment. Someone said swap, and it wasn't true. I learned that envy can make a person believe lies that injure them as much as you. I also learned my father didn't need to raise his voice to teach the truth how to stand up. By the time the fog cleared, the city had sharpened. I finished my coffee and pressed my fingers into the little scar on the railing. Wood remembers. So do we. The day hadn't asked for a promise, but I made one anyway, to be the kind of person this house could keep. I met Jack under the blue fluorescence of a hotel conference room where the coffee tasted like ambition and the carpet swallowed footsteps. I just finished talking about digital banking security to an audience of polite laptops and blinking name badges. During questions, he lifted his hand like someone throwing a rope across a river. Where's the line, he asked, between convenience and the cost of our privacy? Not the legal line. The human one. I didn't have to think. His question sat exactly on the muscle I like to press. Afterward, in the coffee area, he was softer than his voice had been. Freckles. The kind of smile that assumed you were on the same side. He worked in digital marketing, the honest kind, where you try to tell better stories about real things. He didn't Google me. He barely Googled his own hotel room number. I liked the quiet in his questions. We were efficient at becoming us. Weeks braided themselves with texts that arrived at the right temperature. He asked what I cooked when I was sad. I told him toast. He asked what I kept on my desk that meant nothing to anyone else. I showed him a paperclip bent into a star by my father's absent-minded hands. He told me he'd once been sure he'd be a musician, then learned he was better at listening than playing. We married by a lake that made everything sound like prayer. My mother pressed her forehead to mine while mascara dried. He'd be proud, she whispered, meaning my father, the way people do when grief learns to sit quietly at the table. I wanted to believe that pride could be a bridge between the people we lose and the ones we choose. We moved into my downtown apartment, where windows rehearsed sunsets like they had auditions. Jack filled the space with a warmth that belonged to him, socks that never found their pair, a plant he named Kevin, a way of leaving notes that said things like, "Eat the last peach. It's not noble to suffer." A month later, I decided the house on the hill had waited long enough to meet my marriage. I drove us through streets that remembered my bicycle, and when the iron gate slid open, the car quieted as if the engine understood. Jack stepped out slowly, tilted his head the way people do in museums when they want to be respectful and honest at once. "You lived here," he said, awe spreading through his voice like light through a stain of glass. "I grew up here," I said. He touched the stone beside the pond, not to take a picture, but to feel the temperature of it. Inside, he stood beneath the atrium and whispered something I couldn't hear. In the study, he traced a finger over my father's drafting table, then tucked his hands into his pockets like he'd wandered into a church. Questions came later. Harmless at first. How long did it take? Who keeps the maples so disciplined? Then, has it been reappraised? What's the title structure? Where do the decisions live? I didn't mark the moment curiosity became interest and interest became a small itch. I only know I felt it one night over dinner when he asked, "If something happened to your mom, who would inherit?" He smiled, but it didn't reach the part of him that laughed at Kevin the plant's stubbornness. "Jack," I said, "that's a family matter." He shrugged, human enough. But the air between us sharpened, not a knife yet, just the suggestion of an edge. The city darkened outside. The reflection of our table in the window looked like two people sitting slightly farther apart than we were. The text came on a Monday morning that smelled like rain even inside the office. "Jaden, your father needs you," my mother wrote, and the words rearranged my lungs. Hospitals make time behave without manners. Minutes stretch, then snap. My father's skin had learned the color of long winters. He smiled, the way men do when they think they need to protect you from the shape of the room. "Stage 4, the doctor said, as if stages could explain finales. I started living in hallways and plastic chairs. My life shrank into a backpack and a list of people I owed emails to. I read to him. Short lines. Long pauses. He slept with sunlight on his hands. Jazz from an old phone speaker found its way around the tubes, and for a moment, the room remembered who my father had been when kitchens were loud with the sound of breakfast. Jack came, at first with his arms open and his voice lowered. He brought coffee, then sandwiches, then a thin impatience that tried to disguise itself as concern. "How long will this be our life?" he asked one night when the elevator side closed. I didn't answer, because grief is a language that can't translate into timelines. My father died on a quiet morning that felt like the universe had decided not to wake us fully. His hand didn't let go so much as it softened. The garden at home wore black without needing to be told. We buried him beneath the gaze of the maples, the pond keeping its breath. People said nice things and meant them. I wore a dress he would have said was too much for the weather and didn't care. After, my mother handed me a folder heavy enough to have its own truth. His will lived inside it, careful and simple. The house, the heart of his life's geometry, belonged to me. I held the paper, then held the railing on the balcony he'd sanded smooth. Ownership felt less like possession and more like charge. Jack found out from a cousin who had never learned how to keep a sentence on the inside. That night, he asked, too casually, "What are we doing with the title?" I told him grief was a room and I was still standing at the door. "Later," I said. He nodded, then didn't. "If both our names were on it," he added, "things could be cleaner. Legally." Something inside me set down a glass and did not pick it back up. A week passed like a year that had forgotten how to be. He came to the study with papers and a smile that felt like a performance for a camera not present. "Met with a lawyer," he said. "Jerry Peterson." He knows Washington inheritance inside out. This is just a formality. No, I said, slow enough to hear it land. It's not. He waited, then tried a new door. We're married. What's yours is not this, I said. He looked at me as if I'd hidden the sun. Then I guess you won't be surprised I already started the process. The phone screen glowed between us like a small moon, a transfer form, my name crossed out in a red that remembered fire. My mouth learned a new silence. He said words like vested interest and retainer. I said, this is a betrayal. He said, so is your secrecy. We both stood very still while the house listened. I drove to my father's real lawyer, whose name was also Peterson but belonged to a person with an office and a bar number and a framed diploma that wasn't pixelated. He listened the way legal people do when they are measuring both the facts and the weather of the person across from them. There's no licensed Jerry Peterson in this state, he said finally, gently placing the sentence where it could sit without making more of a mess. If money was paid, it was paid to a ghost. The world tilted 5 degrees and then clicked back into place. Jack hadn't only tried to take what wasn't his. He'd given away what was to someone who wore the right tie and knew how to spell transfer. The email that had looked official was a costume. The stamp was theater. The red line through my name was a threat made out of crayons and counterfeit ink. I printed everything that proved the truth and slid it into a folder that warmed under my hand. On the drive home, the city pretended to be ordinary. A woman balanced a coffee, a phone, and a conversation with herself at a crosswalk. A boy kicked a bottle cap into a perfect arc. My car felt like a confession booth. Jack sat at the dining table with a face that had learned the lesson too late. He's not answering, he said. I think I got scammed. I placed the documents between us and the air adjusted. You did, I said. And before that, you tried to scam me. The argument that followed wasn't loud. The quiet ones are the ones that move furniture around inside your chest. He said he felt shut out. I said he had picked the worst door. He said marriage is a merger. I said love isn't a ledger. We stood on different continents and watched the tide retreat. I left him sitting there and packed 2 bags that didn't squeak when the zippers closed. I took the letters my father had written across years of ink and restraint, a sweater that smelled like cedar, and my patience. The elevator down felt like a descent into air. On the street, night had already made peace with itself. I drove to the hill. We filed the restraining order after he returned for a second act. The gate camera framed him in a square of daylight he couldn't soften with apologies. I have a right, he said, voice big for someone that small. Security walked him back the way he'd come. He performed rage for an audience of maples and a pond that didn't clap. Inside the house, the library remembered the sound of paper and the way grief sits in chairs. I opened a drawer and found a letter my father had left for a day like this without knowing what shape this would take. I read it twice. The second time, it sounded like a hand on my shoulder that knew the weight and didn't try to make it smaller. I slept in my childhood room that night, where the window still broke the morning into a soft geometry. The house exhaled. I did too. The memorial asked the garden to be generous. White flowers lined the walkway like sentences that knew where to end. Neighbors arrived carrying quiet, colleagues carried stories. My mother carried herself with the exact dignity the world tends to bow to when it sees it. During the chanting, the gate camera lit the foyer screen with an image I had practiced not wanting. Jack, thinner, a bruise of a night beneath both eyes, holding the posture of a man who had rehearsed regret in front of a mirror. He placed a hand over his chest when our gazes met through the inches of glass and pixels. I stepped onto the porch and didn't cross its edge. Why are you here? To say sorry, he said, and the words looked fragile leaving his mouth. To him. To you. I know I don't deserve to be here. You had the chance to deserve it, I said. You traded it. I was stupid, he said softly. I get that now. The chanting widened in the house behind me. I thought about how grief asks you to be both kind and exact, and how most people choose one and regret it later. Today is not your stage, I said. If you respect me, leave. He didn't move. Or maybe he did and the air disguised it. Security arrived, not as a threat but as a boundary given legs and a uniform. They spoke to him the way people speak to someone who has found a cliff and is pretending it's a bench. He backed away, step by step, and the gate completed the sentence by closing. Inside, no one said his name. The ceremony continued. The house heard memory after memory, each one a nail that holds a frame flush to the wall. When it ended, the pond reflected the sky like a good listener. I found my mother by the tea room and took her hand. It fit the same way it always had, a small miracle hiding in muscles and habit. That night, rain arrived with manners and watered everything that had a root. I sat by the window with a cup of Earl Grey and watched the drops learn the angles of the glass. The gate scene replayed, smaller each time, until it was only a smudge that the mind keeps because it wasn't ready to forgive itself for finally closing the door. 3 days later, the divorce papers found a desk that had seen worse. We signed. No one made eye contact with the pens. When the clerk stamped the last page, the room let out a breath it had been saving for someone. I stood first. "I hope you find your way back to yourself," I said, because I meant it and because the person I want to be would have said it. On the ride back to the hill, the city arched around me like a parent who knows a kid came home late but also brought the sunrise with them. The maples lifted themselves toward weather they didn't control, and I remembered my father telling me once, "We only own the part of the future we can stand upright inside." I set my bag down in the foyer and let the house answer for both of us. Healing arrived disguised as work. We turned the basement into a hall that held laughter without echoing it back too loudly. The second-floor ballroom learned how to swallow piano notes and send them out dressed for good company. My mother arranged flowers as if each stem had a story that just needed a translator. We didn't scale. We curated. 3 events a month. Names learned, not logged. Couples walked through the gate and went quiet the way people do in old churches and fresh forests. The lavender path taught strangers how to walk slowly. The arch learned what vows weigh, then held them anyway. Neighbors came first, a 30th anniversary that smelled like lemon cake and old promises. Then a small wedding where the bride's shoes were sensible and her smile wasn't. I watched from the edges, a steady shadow, making sure the light found people's good sides. Later, in the kitchen, a young caterer cried over a botched sauce, and I taught him my father's trick for emergencies: lower the heat, breathe, and let time do what you can't. The email from Jack arrived when the maples started trading green for gold. "Thank you," the subject line said, and I let it sit like a sealed note on a mantle. When I opened it, he told me he'd found work helping people restart. That he'd learned how to apologize without inviting applause. That he wasn't asking for anything. I believed him. Which is different from inviting him back. I wrote nothing in return. Some chapters end because they conclude, others end because they have the decency to stop. My mother and I developed a morning loop, past the koi, along the lavender, under the arbor, back to the kitchen where the radio always played something that sounded like beginning again. She asked once, "What do you think he'd say about this?" Meaning my father and the house dressed up as a second chance. "He'd ask if the beams are true," I said. "And if we're being kind." At the last wedding of summer, a literature teacher held her bouquet like a thesis about joy. On the lawn, the groom laughed as if he didn't need any other sound for the rest of his life. I stood on the balcony, the wood warm under my palm, and let the image take root. People promising their futures in a place built by a man who believed character is a kind of architecture. The house had learned new music. The pond learned to mirror strangers and make them look like family. We had turned grief into hospitality, inheritance into stewardship, a wound into a doorway. When the season pivoted and the air began to taste like apples and memory, I woke early and crossed the balcony to the railing with the little scar. The lawn below was a soft geometry of footprints and hope. I rested my hand where my father's had rested and felt the grain answer back. Out by the arch, a gust lifted the bride's veil just enough to remind everyone that even joy requires balance. The groom steadied her, and the photographer captured the exact moment love learned how to hold fast. I didn't say the lesson out loud. I left it where it belonged, in the image. In the house that keeps its promises. In the quiet between breaths. Some stories end with a door closing. Mine ends with windows open and a light left on, In case the past ever needs to find its way to the porch, take a breath and keep walking.